Hello, we're talking adjudication in game mastering. So I thought I'd set the mood, but, well, to be honest with you, you set the mood yourself. It's not with all the props and sound effects and that kind of thing. They add to the game, but ultimately it's you who makes the game fun and who makes the game interesting. Now, adjudication comes in several different areas, and I want to talk to each one specifically because a lot of novice GMs or young GMs who just don't have the experience will make these kinds of mistakes. So we want to look at rules versus reality versus narrative. When should the rules be involved in determining your story? Now, the whole game obviously revolves around you rolling a d20 or an other-sided dice to effectively gauge the outcome of an action. But if that outcome is seriously going to change the course of your adventure, or if it's seriously going to impede a character's development within your game, is it necessary to actually go with that roll? Now, I know that there are a lot of you who will disagree with me and who will say that the roll is everything and what the dice says is what must happen. I disagree. The dice is there to act as an element of storytelling. It's there to create tension. If on the roll of a dice your character is about to die, that creates a lot of tension. If the character, however, just dies because they roll badly, that to me is a bit anticlimactic. So generally speaking, what I will do is if the character makes a roll and the roll fails and it's really going to change the story completely, I have one of two choices. Either I give them an additional roll to correct the original mistake, or I create a story point. Now, I'm not talking that I simply insert a giant paladin who comes in and kills everybody and the world is over. I'm talking about bringing in an element of maybe the villain decides to start talking about his great success, giving the other players an opportunity to sneak in and save the fallen comrade before he dies. If, of course, it's a red dragon and he's just breathed 10,000 damage onto a player and the player has onto the character and the character has failed his roll, well, there's not much you can do about that, except that it does call for a saving throw. If he fails his saving throw, well, that's absolutely fine as well, because you can then bring in other things. Now, one of the things I love to bring in, and it just creates a sense of real deification, is you can make a prayer to your deity, in which case you roll a d100, and if you roll 1%, your deity intervenes. It doesn't feel too deus ex machina because it's 1%. So that means the dice god, if you like, is looking out for the character, and this usually satisfies players. On the other hand, I have had it where players have been given various roles and opportunities to survive, and D&D 5th Ed, which we'll be talking about in another module, certainly gives you a lot of opportunities as a game master to keep characters alive. I have had players who have simply rolled negatively 4 times. In that case, then, death comes in. But on another point, if you look at a character breaking into a house and they're trying to be really sneaky about it and they fail their roll, give them an opportunity to recover from that, perhaps, but always use it to create tension. So they fail their roll, the city guard hears them, but doesn't necessarily see them. Maybe the hero guard takes a wander down the alley where he heard the noise coming from, and then you roll, and I roll usually just for fun because the numbers, like I said, to me don't mean anything. They're just there to help the story. And he fails his perception check or his spot check or his observation check or whatever the system is check that you are using, which allows the character to make another stealth roll. Again, if he fails it, well, then the dice are just trying to tell you something and you should change your narrative to adapt. Something that novice GMs often get stuck in, and it's especially within our community where you have, let's say, the slightly more academic player, reality getting in the way of good narrative or of good dice rolls. So here I'm talking specifically, I have a scenario where two players are shooting at goblins inside a cave system, and the one player decides that his character is going to try and bounce an arrow off the side of the cave wall. In reality, this is virtually impossible. Arrows don't contain enough kinetic energy to bounce around like bullets do, so it could arguably be a, sorry, that's impossible. Well, generally speaking, you're playing in a universe that is impossible. So rather than just flat out saying no, give them some modifiers, but not specifically hectic ones, and see what happens. I generally prefer to go on the side of the player if there is something that they want to do and it's out of the ordinary of just, I hit it. I will give them a little bit of leeway. Yes, sure, I'll build in modifiers, but the modifiers stay in my head, which means that when they roll that dice, I determine if it will be more entertaining or less entertaining for the characters to succeed at that attack or at that roll or whatever it is that they're doing. How do I judge whether it's going to be more entertaining or less entertaining? I read my players. If my players are sitting there and they're all looking at that roll, they're all focused on that roll succeeding so that the arrow bounces off the stalactite, hits the stalagmite and kills the Goblin King, well, then you know what? I will, generally speaking, allow it to happen, unless, of course, the player rolls a ridiculously low dice, in which case then, well, I'm sorry, but the failure happened. If, of course, they roll and it's a pretty good roll, I might let them have it. I won't necessarily let them kill the Goblin King, but I'll certainly let them have the roll. So I don't like reality getting in the way. I also don't like GMs who kind of go, well, you're 120 feet away from the target and there's a wind blowing at 5 miles an hour across the bridge that you're standing on, and the humidity is 72%, so your modifier is now +3. That's a ridiculous waste of time and isn't in any way, shape or form entertaining, unless you're playing with a bunch of science majors and you like working out vectors. Don't get bogged down in reality and physics. It doesn't exist. You have giant creatures that breathe fire. Physics is suspended for play. Next, I want to talk about making the call. And this is something that young GMs will have a difficulty with, especially if you're playing with older players. I myself, when I first started out, and even to this day when I play at cons and I don't know the rule systems, I often feel that although I am telling the story, don't necessarily know all of the rules. Does this stop me from playing the game? Not in the slightest. Rules, generally speaking, are there to make sense and to, of course, create a platform for which you can make a story. So as long as you can make a story, you can simply make the rules fit your story. Now, this comes to making the call. A player rolls a dice, they want to achieve something, you're not entirely sure if it's in the rule book or not, but you are in charge of the game. So the simple solution is, does it make sense in your head? If it does, make the call. And don't get bogged down in a debate. There are lots of players out there who really like to debate every nitty-gritty, especially if it is going to get them and their character into a superior position. By superior position, I simply mean the character wants to succeed at everything, so any call that you make that will prevent him from doing that, he will challenge and reference rule book pages. He will look at all of the sub-clauses that might relate to his claim that his call is better than yours. The simplest way to resolve that is to say, this is my call for now. We can look at it after the session. If the player still continues to argue, the best thing to do is to simply say, all right, the session is over. We will now go to the rule books and we'll have a read. And then after that, you can all go home. Players who want to try and manipulate the system are not there to play a narrative game. They are there to win. And of course, you cannot win in a role-playing game. We're telling stories. The more entertaining the story, the closer you are to winning. So when players try and pull rules on me, if I make a call and the player goes, well, actually, it's actually this, and that makes more sense or allows me to change the narrative to being better, then I will say, oh, that's fantastic. I've learned something. That's the new rule system. It's as simple as that. But don't get bogged down in debates. The rest of your players will get bored. They'll go to their cell phones, and that's your session's energy gone. Player actions versus game mechanics. Now, this is a tricky one, and I was debating whether it should be a whole session or not, but player actions metagaming, where the player has knowledge that the character doesn't have, is a very fine line, and you have to simply adjudicate based on what you think is best. I have two groups that I run, one on a Monday night, one on a Thursday night. The Thursday night group is a little metagamey. Everybody in the party knows pretty much what everybody else in the party knows, even though they haven't had a group discussion. My Monday night group is almost the opposite. They will purposefully go out of their way to be ignorant of what the others have planned or spoken about. And that could also just be some of the players that zone out. Anyway, the point is you need to decide how much metagaming you're going to allow into your game. Are players capable or able to know and transfer knowledge to their character? And are you going to say, that's not your character's knowledge, that's your knowledge? It's a fine line, but be aware of it, and don't let it get in the way of the game. If the player says, oh, well, I know my character wants to go and intercept that wagon, which other characters know about, but which his character doesn't know about, you need to say, well, you actually haven't heard that. It gives them an opportunity to actually engage with one another. I'm always amazed at how often players don't have their characters sit down and actually just discuss what's going on. Use that to your advantage and make it drive the story. Whether it's a wedge or a hammer or a nail, keep it in your toolbox to use to make the story better. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this brief exploration of adjudication and that it will make your games run a little bit smoother and your stories a little bit stronger. Hit that like button if you like what you heard, and of course if you want to hear more, hit that subscribe button. In upcoming episodes we'll be looking at 5th edition D&D and the 5th edition D&D character creator. And I know I shouldn't call it 5th edition because it's now just D&D, but while it is 5th edition, deal with it. Till next time, happy gaming.